Yeah. Oh, hello. Um, yeah, we're the 170th New York. We're here. This is outside of Spotsylvania, but I assume you knew that. Um, yeah. What can I do for you? You're with whom? Harper's Weekly. That's that's Greeley's rag, isn't it? What you're far from home, aren't you? Well, I know we are too. Yeah, I'm from New York as well. Um, yeah, we've been volunteered up since '62. I hope that this incessant war ends soon. What's that? Yeah, you can ask me some questions. We're not on the march. I imagine we'll be done soon and back on the march. But we stopped for supper here. Um, yeah. Um, so yeah, how is it? Well, I'll tell you what. Can I be honest with you? Is this going to go? Say, don't quote me on this, but I'll tell you what. I'm discouraged. This is. I volunteered up in '62 with the bands and the bunting and huzzah for the Union. And now all it is marching, days and days and days of boredom, and then hours of terror. I'm over the whole thing. I signed up for the duration, but I'm hoping that this is the last campaign. They tell us that this is Grant's big idea, that this is the final part of the grand strategy. But what do I know? I'm just a private. Yeah, I miss home. I got a letter from my sister. She talks about how one of my pards back home, he got in with the Bowery boys and got in a row with the Dead Rabbits down to 5 points. That's terrible, but at this point, I'd rather be doing that than this, marching 25 miles a day. Our rations are getting slim. Where am I? Well, for the folks at home, we're near Spotsylvania. We're running those revs out. Those CSES are on the run, and I'm hoping that this will be the last big campaign. But yeah, I don't know. Other than that, is there anything else I'd like to say? I wish this war were over. That is all. But thanks so much for asking me questions. Good luck to you.
All right, everyone. It is nice to see you all today. Let me tell you where we're headed today, and then we'll get there. So what I'd like to do is do a little check-in with you today. Then we haven't gotten up and around in a while, so I'd like to do some Civil War calisthenics with you. And then talk a little bit about the strategy, the overarching strategy of the Civil War. Our Civil War soldier earlier talked about that, mentioned it, that they didn't know what was going on, that they were hoping that the war would end soon. We're going to talk about what he was talking about in just a minute. So that's kind of where we're headed. But before we get started, I want you to turn to a partner and talk to them about a time in your life when the situation seemed never to end, and it was just overwhelming, and you had to deal with it. Kind of like our Civil War soldier, right? There was a lot that was out of his control. So I want you to turn and talk to someone about that, and just talk talk to them about a time in your life when that happened. So take a minute and do that. And oh, you will need to take notes on this today. Put it in your notebook. It'll help you on the test as we go. And of course, as always, remember questions. Oh, hi, Emily. I'm so glad you're here. Hey, would you mind just sticking around after class? You're not in trouble. I just want to catch up with you a little bit. Thanks. Okay, turn and talk. Mark, set, go. All right, if you're not quite finished, that's all right. Let's pull back together. What did you come up with? Yeah, Max. Yeah, absolutely. That it's a lot like the COVID time, right? Things are kind of out of our control. We've got to kind of figure it out. I guess there's an overarching plan about all of this. Yeah, how does that make you feel? Somebody else. Yeah, Darlene, go ahead. Absolutely. Yeah, it's overwhelming, right? Kind of like our Civil War soldier. And as we talk about this, thank you. As we talk about this, I want to kind of keep that in mind because, you know, we could talk about this and kind of make it boring and blah, 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 but it really is real life. And for these people in the 1860s, this was real life. The decisions that Lincoln and early on Scott and later Grant and Davis and Lee on the other side were making affected people, affected them in positive and negative ways, right? And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. So what I'd like you to do before we get into the strategy itself is I'd like everybody to stand up. Yes, yes, stand up, I know. Like I told you before, I would never ask you to do anything I'm not willing to do. I know that's not saying much, but here we go. All right, so there were several components to the strategy of the Civil War, and I was trying to think of what's a good way to kind of remember this stuff, right? And so, and to get you up out of your seats and that sort of thing. So what I'd like you to do is, first of all, follow along with me, and then I'm going to have somebody else lead this for us. So these are calisthenics, and so I'm going to give you some words and some actions to go with them to help us remember the strategy of the Civil War. All right, so you do what I do and say it after me. Suffocate, liberate, cut, chop, decapitate, grind, gain, maintain. All right, let's try it again. Ready? With me this time. Suffocate, liberate, cut, chop, decapitate, grind, gain, maintain. All right, Will, would you lead us through this, please? All right. Yeah, you can do it. It's okay. It's just us. It's okay. All right, here we go. Suffocate, liberate, cut, chop, decapitate, grind, gain, maintain. Excellent. Let's hear it for him. Nicely done. All right, have a seat. Let's talk a little bit about strategy. So you know that when the war starts, both sides have to have a plan, right? And the plan for the North, or the federal forces, the Union, had 6 components. Actually, at the beginning it had 5, but we'll talk about that. And they were put together initially by George Winfield Scott, who you remember what we talked about him when we talked about the Mexican War. Remember, he is old fuss and feathers. He was the head of the military during this time period at the beginning of the war, but he was old, gout-ridden, overweight. He was past his prime, right? So he will retire shortly after the war begins, but not before he helps Lincoln, the newly minted president elected in 1860, come up with a strategy. And the strategy was called the Anaconda Plan. All right, let's move ahead. I'll tell you when to stop. Okay, go back one. Thank you. So the anaconda plan, you know, the anaconda is a snake, right? And what do anaconda snakes do? Yeah, Kiana? That's right. Yeah, they suffocate their prey, right? And so that's the idea behind this. And the first part was to, as you remember from our calisthenics, to suffocate, right? And so the idea was to cut off commerce or trade between the Confederacy and other countries, especially France and Great Britain, because they didn't have a lot of manufacturing, right? The Union had about 80% plus of the manufacturing, and so the South was dependent on bringing goods from other countries. And if the Union could stop that up, that would really help in the war effort, right? And at first, this was really a leaky thing, because this, as you can see, is a huge boundary, right? And the US Navy was not huge at this time, right? And so what they realized very quickly was that about 95% of that commerce or of that trade happened at about 3 different ports: Charleston, New Orleans, there was a smaller port in Florida. And if the Union ships could guard those ports and not let ships in and out for trade in those areas, that really helped their cause a whole lot. All right, so you remember suffocate. What's next? That's right, liberate. Let's talk about that. Go ahead and click some more. Thank you. That's good. Back one. So the liberate part of this has to do with the Emancipation Proclamation. And you remember the 5 C's, right? And we've talked a lot in here about the idea of complexity, right? The Emancipation Proclamation is one of those complex issues that adds complexity to our story. And so what happens is that liberate means to liberate the slaves, to free the slaves. Now, we think of the Emancipation Proclamation as kind of a cultural, social document, freeing the slaves and that sort of thing. But really, we can look at it through the lens of a military document, right? Think about what is the backbone of the Confederacy that grows the food, that does the manual labor, that really makes the Confederacy what it is. It is the slave population. So Lincoln realizes that if you can destroy that population by freeing them, then that will really cripple the Confederacy. Now, we'll talk about other reasons that he had for that were more compassionate and that sort of thing. But this is an interesting way to look at this. Now, when did the Emancipation Proclamation happen? Emancipation Proclamation happened after the Battle of Antietam. And you remember the Battle of Antietam is the largest bloodiest single day of fighting in the Civil War. And it was one of two major times that the Confederacy worked on the offensive. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But it was, and although it was technically a draw, because Lee's forces retreated, that was enough of a win for Lincoln that this allows him to create this Emancipation Proclamation, which will then go into effect on January 1st, 1863. Okay. All right, what's next? Suffocate, liberate, cut, right? All right, let's pull this up. Thank you. And so this is cutting the Confederacy in two. And the most logical place to do that is down the Mississippi. And as you can see here, this is the Mississippi River. It's a pretty daunting task, And what the Union forces do is they start coming down the Mississippi, or actually the land around the Mississippi, and then they start sailing up the Mississippi from New Orleans. They occupy New Orleans, which has some really interesting stories in and of itself. But this is what they do, and their goal was to take over this large inland port at Vicksburg, Mississippi. And so they work their way down. We're going to talk about the specifics of this a little later. But but a guy named Grant works his way down, and then an admiral named Farragut works his way up, and they do meet at Vicksburg. They surround Vicksburg, and for a month just cut off Vicksburg, bomb it, or lob mortars into it, and they finally surrender. Vicksburg will surrender on July 4th, 1863, and that achieves cut. But it's that divide and conquer type of idea, right? All right, next. Chop. Okay, so this is once you have cut the Confederacy in half, then you can chop them into pieces and destroy their ability to make war. And William Tecumseh Sherman was the perfect person to do this. He is the one that coined the term "war is hell" or "war is all hell." He took his troops down, and he didn't. Most times, troops would have a wagon train behind them, so wagon after wagon after wagon after wagon of supplies and food. He did not do that. He had his troops forage or live off the land, and what the primary sources tell us, the diaries, especially like Mary Chestnut's diary from Dixie, which is a great primary source if you're interested in this stuff. She says that they came down like locusts. And you can imagine thousands of troops that are hungry coming into say a plantation. They're gonna get all the food they can. And so this March to the Sea, which happened in 1864, as you can see here, from the summer of 1864 down to December, was just devastating to Georgia. Sherman was quoted as saying, I want to make Georgia howl. Wow. Yeah, this is pretty crazy. We'll talk more about that, but this is the chop part. All right, let's move on. And then there's the decapitate, right? So just as a reminder, everybody up. All right, here we go. Suffocate, liberate, cut, chop, decapitate, grind, right? Good. Okay, we'll stop there. Have a seat. So decapitate means to take the other's capital, to cut off their head. And this was tried with something called the Peninsula Campaign at the beginning of the war in 1862. McClellan, a general named McClellan, tried this. But as Lincoln said, McClellan has the slows. McClellan really loved his army and loved drilling his army and making them look perfect, but he didn't want to, sully them by using them. In fact, kind of a funny story about Lincoln. He said at one point he wrote McClellan a note and said, "If you are not using the Army of the Potomac, that's the troops that are going to take Richmond, may I borrow them for a while and take them on campaign," right? So that was that. So the first attempt at decapitate was not successful. The second one, which was Grant and his Wilderness Campaign, which gets into grind, was successful. That's in early '65 is when the decapitate happened. All right, let's move on to the last part. This was added later when Grant was recalled from, you remember that he was coming down the Mississippi with his troops and was recalled to Washington to take over the Army of the Potomac in 1864. And so this is kind of his addition to this, right? And it was called the Meat Grinder Campaign, which, yeah, that sounds pretty gross, right? Because the idea was to engage the enemy, as you can see here, as many places as often as possible, just to end the war. Because by this time, Union troops outnumbered Confederate troops almost 3 to 1. Yeah, and so that was that. Now, kind of an interesting aside about Grant. When Lincoln first heard about Grant, Grant was still over working his way down the Mississippi with like Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, those battles, right? And and Lincoln and Grant's fighting and he's winning battles, and Lincoln's like to his other generals, like, what's going on here? Who is this guy? And his generals say, well, President, Mr. President, you don't want to, you don't want him because he's taken to strong drink. He's a drunkard. And Lincoln, in his great wit, was quoted as saying, well, find out what he's drinking and send a case to my other generals so they'll fight too. Yeah, Lincoln had a great sense of humor. So this is the Wilderness Campaign. This is where we picked up at the beginning of class with our soldier that was being interviewed by what he called Greeley's Rag, which was Horace Greeley's magazine, a newspaper, Harper's Weekly. And this was the Wilderness Campaign of going down and taking Richmond, that decapitate, and then it was just grind. In fact, this is where sometimes historians say this is where the dog tag was invented, because they were just handing out, and who's they, like the Women's Sanitary Commission or the Women's Christian Commission would hand out these things that looked like luggage tags, and they would pin them to the inside of their fatigue blouses, their 4-button sack coats, and they would have their name and address, because so many people were being killed that way they could know where to ship the bodies home. I mean, it was just nasty, right? So that's the Union strategy. Let's finish up with the Confederacy and see what their strategy was. This is a very famous photo of 3 Confederate prisoners at Gettysburg. And so with those guys in the background, let's take a look at the 2 big goals that the South had in their fighting. So the first was to gain. The South, kind of like the fledgling United States in the Revolutionary War, needed the help of other countries. And in fact, this picture shows some military observers from other countries observing what the Confederacy was doing. And if you've seen that old movie Gettysburg that is way too long and the beards are way too bad, they show some of this. So that's one part that is historically accurate. I'll show you some other parts of that movie later. I have some friends that were in it, and we'll laugh at them together. But this is what's going on there. So to gain acceptance, and they had to go on offense in order to do this. And they tried that in '62 unsuccessfully at Antietam, and we'll talk more about Antietam when we get to battles, and most notably at Gettysburg, where that was the big turning point. With the Union victory, the Confederacy lost, and they lost their last big opportunity for gain. All right, and then finally, maintain. And this is a 2-parter. This is a 2-for-1, right? So they wanted to maintain their borders, so they were fighting a defensive war, and they wanted to maintain their way of life, right? And we've talked about that way of life and the social structures of that. You might remember that from last week. So that was that. So as we wrap things up today, go ahead and stand up, and let's go through our calisthenics one more time, and then we'll be wrap up for today. I have a couple of announcements, then we'll wrap up. Okay, everybody, ready? Here we go. Suffocate. liberate, cut, chop, decapitate, grind, gain, maintain. Very good. All right, couple of things. You saw the reading assignment for today. It's also on Google Classroom. Keep up with your recitations. You guys are doing an awesome job. I really appreciate it. Bell's going to ring here pretty quick. Make sure that you look over your notes and make sure you have everything in mind, and we will see you all tomorrow. Take care, everybody.